That's great. Kia ora, welcome, welcome. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Won't be too long before we are underway. We're just waiting for a few more to be joining us, and then we will kick into it. So not long to go at all. Nice to see you saying hello in the chat too. Kia ora. Just give it a few more seconds. We've got more people joining us, which is lovely. Well, it's just gone 12:01, so I think we will kick into it. All good to go, Silvia?
Yeah, great.
Super. Welcome, everyone. My name is Faye Johnson, and I'm part of the team here at GROW, based in the sunny Hawke's Bay. Absolutely delighted to have you join us today at this presentation, which is part of our free webinar series during, of course, Mental Health Awareness Week. Absolutely delighted to be working with Silvia and yeah, to have her presentation today on the climate and working through anxiety levels, etc. I'd like to start with a karakia, and then I will pass over to Silvia. Just before I do so, just a reminder, if you haven't already, please mute yourself now. This just means that there's no background noise interruptions whilst the presentation is happening. Thank you. He honore, he kokorio ki te atua, he mangaronga ki te whenua, he whakarau paki na tangata katoa, hanga e te atahau he nakahau ho, ka roto ka tena o moto. Whakatongi atu wairo te pū, he e whene, i toto, i o moto. He akahoki, ina mahi, o tena rei rā. And this is saying, honour and glory, peace on earth, goodwill to all people. Let us open our hearts and our minds to the learning here today and embrace the togetherness of this learning experience. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Silvia.
Thank you so much, Faye, and for Fiona for organising today. What a great gift that GROW is offering this series free for around the motu. Well, ka mihi atu ahau kia koutou e huhi mai nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Honore ke te atua kaharawa, ki te tama ki te wairua tapu. Ko koe te kaihanga, te timatanga me te mutunga, te kai karakia, te kai whakaoranga o te ao katoa. So welcome and thank you for joining this seminar on mental health and climate change. Ko Silvia Purdie taku ingoa no Ingarani oku tipuna Presbyterian Tahahi, Ngāti tūmatoenga te iwi. My husband is an army chaplain. Kai tiakitanga te mahi, I work in environmental sustainability. Mana kitanga te kaupapa. I also work as a counsellor, as a supervisor, and also a trainer and a church minister. It is my honour to present to you today on a topic which connects the massive environmental issues we face in our time with the personal, the emotional, and the relational. My starting point is that climate change is happening and will only impact us more and more through the years ahead. I'm not going into climate science in this seminar. I won't be showing you photos of polar bears floating on ice or graphs. I don't have the kind of brain that easily remembers facts and figures, but I do have a PowerPoint, so I will start with that. Bear with me one moment. There. Uh-oh, I seem to have lost the Zoom image. Fiona, is that okay? Can you see me? Can you see the...
You're not sharing just yet, Sylvia.
Oh, that's right.
Try again.
I didn't work. Sorry.
There you go. That looks good.
From start.
Perfect.
Kate's pie. Got there in the... Right. Stand with me at dawn on Paraparaumu Beach, looking out to Kapiti. That's my image for the seminar. So the seminar is in two halves, nice and simple, with two questions. Here is the outline. First, what are the mental health challenges of climate change? And second, how do we manage those constructively? So challenges and strategies. Each half has 4 key ideas, as you can see there. And after each section, I will give you a couple of minutes, hopefully, to reflect. And there will also be time for questions at the end. Please post your questions in the chat box and Fiona will keep an eye on them for me, and Faye. So if we could stay on mute the whole time, please. I'd love to continue the conversation with you. My email address and phone number will be at the end slide and will be also emailed to you after the seminar, together with links with resources that I refer to. I make no claim to be an expert in the field of environmental psychology or climate science or mental health. This talk has emerged from my work with community organisations over the last few years, as I have pursued the mahi of resourcing the community sector in climate change and sustainability. All are steep learning curve for me. I am passionate about helping ordinary people engaged creatively with these huge problems that we face. So I begin with challenges. The first mental health challenge of climate change is that most of the time, a lot of us are actually quite good at not being challenged by climate change. I call this bubble wrap. We all have some kind of insulation to protect us from being overwhelmed by fear and anxiety, and climate change seems so huge. What can we do and how can we possibly make a difference? Collectively, our defences against facing up to climate crisis resist change and enable us to continue business as usual, even though we know this is not working. There are little bits of bubble wrap that enable us to fill up the car with petrol or buy a takeaway coffee cup. We tell ourselves that it is a problem, but it's not my problem right now. And there are the massive rolls of bubble wrap that make people reject climate science completely. Psychology has 2 labels for this, as I put there: denial and dissociation. One of the best TED Talks about this is by the Norwegian Per Espen Stoknes, I believe. He describes this as apocalypse fatigue. I encourage you to watch his video and we'll email you the link. He draws a series of walls that people put up to protect themselves from the bad news of climate change. What do you notice in yourself that insulates you from the terrifying warnings of climate disaster? I'm not saying that bubble wrap is necessarily a bad thing, well managed, but collectively it is a terrible thing because it stops us from doing what must be done to protect the Earth and the future from more and more global warming. We must change, and to change we must face the facts. Disconnecting is a bad thing because when we split off part of ourselves to protect ourselves, we whittle away at our humanity. If we cannot face our fears and grief and guilt about climate change, we become less able to feel joy or hope or peace. Dissociation numbs us, and depression is a result. So what does climate crisis bubble wrap look like? Well, it looks like collective silence. Just let's not talk about it. It looks like I'll just look after my own family, our own personal security. It's a form of kind of empathy loss. I just can't care anymore. And I hear this a lot from like social service agencies, and I'm sure you can relate. We have a whole lot more important things to worry about right now. And that's a kind of a capacity overload. There are, of course, many in our society internationally who genuinely feel that this is all a grand conspiracy and that it's all fake news. I work a lot in the Christian community in Aotearoa, and I see the influence of end times thinking. If climate crisis is part of the coming apocalypse, then why try to prevent it? That would be like, bring it on. And I'm sure you can think of other forms of denial and dissonance. It is much easier to blame other people, whether that is the government or the farmers or the greenies or whoever, than to seriously grapple with the implications of global warming. Once the bad news of climate crisis gets through our defences, we hit the second big challenge, anxiety. I call this dread, kind of a chronic state of looming disaster, dread. Psychologists call it eco-anxiety, and there is now a diagnosis for that. The American Psychological Association defines eco-anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom. Glenn Albrecht defines it as the generalized sense that the ecological foundations of existence are in the process of collapse. My colleague in Finland, Panu Pikala, names it more simply as difficult feelings because of the ecological crisis. So what are your difficult feelings? It might be standing in a supermarket feeling hungry, but not being able to choose any food to buy because the plastic is bad and the food miles are bad and using animals is bad and chemicals are bad and the prices are bad and there's just nothing good to eat. This kind of moral no win, lose dilemma we get stuck in. It might be the cold pressure of guilt. I used to treasure my memory of my wonderful trip to Italy, but now it's like infected with the guilt of all of those carbon emissions. It might be kids shutting themselves in their rooms all day, because if the ecological foundations of existence are in the process of collapse, then what is the point in going to school? In terms of what we know about our brains, these are flight and freeze responses as the brain soaks in a constant soup of stress response hormones. Eco-anxiety is a trauma response. So what do you know about trauma? I'm sure you know a lot about trauma, especially people here in Christchurch know a lot about this. Trauma is when our sense of safety is shattered by events that overwhelm our ability to cope. And this impacts on our daily lives. You know about these things, how trauma kind of gets us in these mental loops, constantly reliving an event, feeling on edge, feeling that danger may strike at any time. It impacts our abilities to think clearly and to be planning and proactive, and it can block emotion, be avoidance and numb. Many people around the world are already experiencing traumatic climate events, worsened for many by COVID-19. However, few of us here in Aotearoa have yet experienced traumatic climate crisis events directly. So why are we so traumatized? The answer in psychological terms is that eco-anxiety is a form of pre-traumatic stress. Pre-traumatic stress. It's a term that came out of studies of soldiers in wartime, knowing that they were going to have to go into the trenches or the battlefield. It was you could see the trauma before it happened and its emotional and mental effects. Pre-traumatic stress is being stuck in helpless anticipation of a future traumatizing event, not being able to do anything about it or protect ourselves or others. Symptoms include the sort of anger and panic, obsessive, intrusive thoughts, and which are increasingly evident among those who stare at the problem of climate change head on. And you may have heard terms like climate burnout, and you may well be experiencing yourself forms of exhaustion and fatigue, overload. These are all symptoms of chronic anxiety. So I invite you to think about this question and to maybe pop some answers in the chat box as we go along. So, is anxiety about the world a bad thing? How might eco-anxiety be helpful or unhelpful? Any anxiety can be a very unpleasant experience. However, my colleague Panu Pikala argues that eco-anxiety is actually a moral emotion. It is based on an accurate appraisal of the severity of the ecological crisis. He argues that it can be a positive thing when it leads people to reevaluate the situation, search for better information, and make changes in individual and collective behaviour. So, what do you think about that? Number 3, climate change highlights and intensifies many aspects of injustice between nations and between generations. The injustice of climate change is not an individual problem. It is a massive social problem. Those with the least resources will be hit hardest. This places climate change squarely in the middle of the agenda for any organisation seeking to address inequality, both here in Aotearoa and anywhere in the world. I recommend reading the Ministry for the Environment's Climate Change Risk Assessment for New Zealand. The snapshot document is an easy read, and so this is the heading. They split the risks up into different headings. These are the top 2 climate risks for humanity and social. The number 1 top risk is displacement from storms and rising seas. And number 2, also tagged as an extreme risk, is the risk of exacerbating existing inequalities and creating new and additional inequalities due to the differential distribution of climate change impacts. This is huge for the social and health services in Aotearoa. It's huge for anyone who understands how damaging inequality is. At a personal, emotional level, one important response to this is anger, I'd suggest. It's not fair. We are seeing this in our young people. They are pissed off that they get to inherit a bunch of massive problems. My friend Michael Apati is a psychotherapist here in Christchurch and a climate activist. He spoke last week and encouraged us to feel our anger He said, the climate crisis is just one symptom of massive injustice and inequality and oppression. If you feel a surge of anger powering you up, if you feel clear and decisive in your thinking and solid within yourself, that is the emotion of anger bringing you its gifts. Anger strengthens us to recognize and deal with injustice. So how do we hold our frustration and disappointment and anger in emotionally healthy ways so that these don't turn inward in shame or outward in blame or hurt those closest to us? My fourth challenge is loss. We know because the climate scientists tell us that global warming will lead to the destruction of natural habitats and the loss of species. The more warming, the more habitat and species loss, potentially even including our own species and the end of civilization as we know it. To stay with what is highly probable and probably inevitable, I'm returning to the climate Riskus snapshot document. The top 2 risks to our natural environment are coastal erosion, storms, and even more pests. I'm rather fond of our bird life here in Aotearoa. I read this and it tells me that birds who live and nest on the coast will be smashed by sea level rise and storms, and birds who live and nest in the forest will be smashed by predators. And I feel really sad about that. Do you feel grief for what may be lost in the future? Personality comes into this. My husband responds to what he senses through his senses. He's an in the present kind of guy. Me, I am highly intuitive. I can clearly see things that don't exist yet or have not yet happened. This is fabulous for creative thinking, but its downside with climate change is that I can picture in my mind's eye this beach stripped of its soft golden sand, the Kapiti Council desperately trying to hold back the tide with rock and concrete. It's not a pretty picture, not nearly as nice as that. There is a beautiful piece of regenerating forest on Banks Peninsula where I help out, and I can picture the kānuka trees burning and black with when the fierce droughts come, as they will. Hopefully it doesn't burn down, but I feel grief about that. This is a mental health challenge and we call it anticipatory grief. Grief is the process of coming to terms with loss. To be human at this time is to live with massive ongoing loss and to care about that and to grieve it. We have rituals for grieving when a person we love dies, but how do we grieve the destruction of natural places or the extinction of a species? Ecological grief is painful, but an honest response to the losses of climate crisis. Grief is both a challenge and a strategy for mental health. To grieve well requires honesty and courage. One word for this is lament. Hannah Malcolm writes, "We are struggling to acknowledge what we have already lost and what is too late for us to save. Our failure to acknowledge these things does not make them go away. But to lament, we must name the damage, express our grief, act out restitution, and so access restoring forgiveness." Hope, she claims, like lament, becomes a way of being in the world. So these are my 4 mental health challenges of climate change: bubble wrap, dread, injustice, and loss. I'm going to stop talking now for a couple of minutes to give you space to catch up with your own responses to all of this. These are big, and they hook on to other sources of defensiveness and fear and anger and grief in our own stories. I honour your courage in facing these things square on today. So if you're okay with this, here is a question for reflection. And I do invite you to grab a piece of paper and a pen if you've got one handy, or just sit and be quiet for a minute. We will take 2 minutes now. How do you notice these challenges affecting you personally? And how do you notice these challenges affecting the people you work with, your clients or patients or service users, your colleagues? So, it's 25 past. We'll come back at 28 past. Have it. We've got good time. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. We'll have another pause later on. Were there any comments about the question about whether anxiety is a bad thing?
We've had quite a lot of comments, yeah. Let's have a look.
I'm going to pull out a couple for us.
There's been a couple of comments actually about choosing to delay or reduce or not have children.
Ah, right.
And also travelling overseas, you know, to see family and whānau. How realistic is that in the future?
Yeah, yeah.
Yep. And want that feeling of wanting to control other people's behaviour.
Okay.
That's a really interesting one, but one that, you know, we all resonates with us all.
Someone's commented about advising children for career choices for the future. What will still be necessary?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I look forward to reading them all later, but we'll move on for now. Yeah, I guess my comments just on that was that anxiety, eco-anxiety is good when it motivates us and bad when it disables us. Like guilt can motivate change, or it can send us down spirals of self-loathing. Fear can push us into action, or it can trap us in our bedrooms. Grief can soften our hearts in gratitude for what we love, or it can kind of flatline into depression. It's what we're talking about all week, really, through Mental Health Awareness Week. What promotes mental health? Back to Panu again. He says a key question is how to increase the adaptive potential in people's experiences of eco-anxiety and to alleviate the paralysing forms of eco-anxiety. Well, how indeed? I have 4 principles for mental health in climate crisis. First is to manage our intake. Well, here's the thing. You see, every day for the rest of my life and my kids' lives, there will be climate disasters happening somewhere in the world. We call this climate emergency, and we are in it. But the human brain cannot stay permanently in a state of emergency. We are not designed to function in a constant state of shock, which is a problem because our news media and our social media feed on shock. Good information is an essential part of good action. But information about the climate is depressing often, if not terrifying, and it overloads our mental and emotional processing capacity, and it can bombard us from every side, whether or not you go looking for it. The answer is not, I would argue, to block out all information about climate change. I have already claimed that to do so is to fall into mentally unhealthy traps of denial and dissociation. But we do all need proactive strategies to manage our intake of information and news. So I have 4 strategies for that for you. The first is to be aware of how it affects you. Self-awareness. You can see I'm a trained counsellor, can't you? Self-awareness is the start. Notice what you hear and see and read, and notice how that impacts on your own thinking and emotions. That's the first step. Just be aware of that, so we're not just constantly reacting, right? Secondly, I would suggest read reports, not news feed. Be proactive about your climate crisis intake of information. Personally, I recommend not overloading your mental capacity with other people's reactions. Go to the source material, which has the best chance of being well researched and reviewed. If you hear on the news about some new report, which we seem to hear every week, find the report if you've got the capacity for that. Find it and read that, not just what other people say about it. Be brave in absorbing accurate information. And closer to the source is a good principle. And give yourself a break. A core strategy, you know this, for dealing with anxiety is to give the brain downtime. Let the stress hormones drain away. Breathe, feel safe and rest. It is vital to feel calm, even just occasionally. So at least some days, don't watch the news, don't listen to the latest on the wildfires or the storm damage or the species extinction figures or even mental illness figures. Let others deal with that for today. Sometimes. You don't carry it all on your shoulders. And lastly, search out good news. I am not at all Pollyanna-ish about climate crisis, but there really are awesome people out there doing awesome things. There genuinely is hope for positive change, and new visions of sustainable futures are being lived out. We just don't hear about them on the news or our Facebook feeds because bad news gets attention, right? Drama gets clicks. So I do encourage you to seek out some good news stories, and I'll send you some links of just a few suggestions for websites and podcasts that are positive and accurate. Okay, second one, action, collective action in particular. One of our global leaders in the field of trauma recovery is Judith Herman, and she writes this generally about trauma, that social action serves as the strongest antidote to traumatic experience. It creates an alliance with others based on cooperation and shared purpose. I strongly believe that climate change is a shared crisis, so needs shared solutions. Individual actions are great, but they can leave us vulnerable to despair and guilt and various other things. They can also feed anxiety and obsessive rule-based living. Working together as community organisations detoxes the bad news with positive progress. We can encourage each other and celebrate, and we can tackle really big problems in creative ways when we work together. I have 2 specific recommendations for you. The first is to join a sustainability organisation. Aotearoa has many wonderful sustainability centres and climate justice action groups, and many have strong global connections. There's 350.org, and there are some Pacific Climate Warriors group. I highly recommend Ora Tai Ao for anyone working in health. You might want to connect with Extinction Rebellion, or there's Generation Z, Forest and Bird, School Strikes for Climate, Coal Action Network, Climate Justice. I mean, don't join all of them or your inbox will crash, but pick 1 or 2. I wonder what organisations you are part of, and I invite you to put that in the chat if you've got an organisation that you'd like to fly the flag for. Personally, I'm part of a faith-based organisation called Arosha, which does conservation and hope. Our conservation project, we have several around the country, but our main one is in Raglan. I'm not personally out there on Karioi Mountain setting traps to catch stoats so they don't eat the seabird chicks, but I love knowing that together we are doing that, and we're inspiring people in churches all around the country to be doing forms of environmental action. This, for me, is my best inoculation, I suppose, against eco-anxiety, that together we are making a positive difference. So what might this look like in your organisation? It is great to have, to individually support climate action organisations, but you can have a far bigger impact in your own organisation. So this is my second recommendation, and the space that I have thrown myself into in setting up Place Consultancy, which is to build environmental sustainability into our community sector. You know, Aotearoa has thousands and thousands of community agencies and charitable trusts. Which ones are you part of? They're all dedicated to looking after our people. What if they also found ways to look after the environment? How awesome would that be? Human health, including mental health, is inextricably bound up with environmental health. We can no longer take our natural support systems for granted. Collective action as social services, as community trusts, as health providers, inspires our teammates and resources the whānau that we connect with. What if every youth work organisation addressed young people's fears for the earth by practical action? What if every agency has plans in place to reduce their carbon emissions and landfill waste? This is my spot for a bit of shameless self-promotion, a little taste of my approach at Place Consultancy. This is the model that I work from, a sustainability map for community organisations. This is just a really brief summary here, showing a range of ways that you can grow your sustainability strategy. And I'm not going to go into them all now. This slide just shows where it branches out to, where it can take you in terms of questions to address and ways to engage. You can find it on the Place website, or I can email it to you. You don't necessarily need a consultant, but in my experience, having someone come in from the outside brings a fresh perspective and enables an organisation to shift from being bogged down in problems to sparking creative potential that can actually be fun and energising for you and your colleagues. I am going to take another half a minute break because my computer.
Oh, I wonder if Silvia's battery has just died. Bear with us, everybody. Hopefully she can plug it in and catch up with us. Bear with us one moment.